When my grandparents passed away, it was tough on the whole family. They had lived in the same house for decades, and after they were gone, my parents decided to let me move in there. I was in my early 20s, just starting to live on my own, and it seemed like the perfect opportunity to have my own space. The house was bigger than what I was used to, but it felt comforting. It was filled with memories, and I figured it would be nice to keep it in the family. To avoid feeling too lonely, I decided to adopt a dog, a German Shepherd named Max. He was a big guy, loyal, and I knew he'd make me feel safer in such a big house. Plus, I'd always wanted a dog, and now that I was living on my own, it felt like the right time. The first few weeks went smoothly. Max and I settled into a routine: work, walks, meals, and the occasional late-night TV binge. Everything was normal, peaceful even, until that one night. It started like any other evening. I had finished dinner and was sitting in the living room, watching TV, when Max started acting strange. He got up from where he'd been lying and started growling softly. At first, I thought maybe he'd heard a raccoon or some other animal outside. It wasn't unusual for him to get worked up over small noises. But then he walked over to the basement door. The door was closed, but Max was fixated on it. He stood there, staring, his growls growing louder. His ears were up, and his whole body was tense. Something wasn't right. At first, I brushed it off. "Come on, Max, it's nothing," I said, trying to calm him down. But he didn't move. He just kept staring at that door, growling. That's when I started to feel uneasy. I hadn't been down in the basement in days, and there was no reason anyone or anything should be down there. But Max wouldn't let up. He was locked onto that door like something was behind it, and his growling wasn't stopping. My heart started to race. I didn't want to go down there. The basement in this house had always creeped me out. It was old, with creaky wooden steps, and it always felt too cold, even in the summer. But Max was acting so out of character, I knew I had to check it out. So I grabbed a flashlight and slowly opened the basement door. Max immediately started barking, loud and aggressive, like he was ready to attack something. That didn't help my nerves. I flipped on the basement light, but the switch only illuminated part of the stairs. The rest of the basement was still in shadows. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone down there?" I stepped onto the first creaky step, flashlight in hand, and Max followed closely behind, barking nonstop. My heart was pounding in my chest. Each step down felt heavier than the last. The air in the basement was cool, damp, and smelled like old wood and mildew. I scanned the room with the flashlight, my hands shaking. There were just old boxes, some furniture, and random stuff that had been stored down there for years. But something didn't feel right. I had this nagging feeling that someone was watching me, that I wasn't alone. Max stopped barking, but he didn't stop growling. He was still focused on the far corner of the basement, near an old storage room that my grandpa used to keep his tools in. I didn't want to go over there, but Max was inching closer to it, like he was tracking something. I took a deep breath and walked over to the storage room door. It was slightly ajar. My flashlight flickered as I got closer, and for a moment I thought I heard a faint shuffle inside. My blood ran cold. I quickly slammed the storage room door shut and bolted back up the stairs, Max right behind me. I locked the basement door as soon as I got to the top and sat down, trying to calm my racing heart. I grabbed my phone and called my dad. "Dad, something's not right." Max was barking at the basement, and when I went down there, I swear I heard something. My dad didn't hesitate. "Call the police. Don't go back down there." I felt stupid for not thinking of that myself, but I was too freaked out to care. I dialed 911 and explained the situation. They told me to stay put and that officers were on the way. It felt like forever before the police arrived, but when they did, they took me seriously. They searched the entire house, including the basement. I waited outside with Max, who had finally calmed down, but I was still on edge. When the officers came back up, they told me they didn't find anyone in the house. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. But they did find something odd in the basement. The old storage room? It had been rummaged through, and some cash that my grandparents had kept in a locked box was gone. Someone had been down there, all right? But they were long gone by the time the police arrived. They asked me if I had noticed anything else missing, but I hadn't even known the cash was there. My parents had forgotten about it too. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough to confirm that someone had been hiding in the basement, watching and waiting. That thought still freaks me out. I ended up staying at my parents' house for the next few nights. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been down there might come back, and I wasn't ready to face that possibility. I moved out of that house not long after. The memories of my grandparents made it hard to leave, but after that night, I couldn't feel safe there anymore. I still think about it sometimes, about who might have been in the basement that night and how long they had been hiding there before Max noticed. I guess I'll never know. I've always hated basements. Ever since I was a kid, I couldn't stand going down there. Something about the cold, the shadows, the quietness, it always made me feel uneasy. I grew up in an old house, one that had been passed down through the family, and like a lot of older houses, the basement wasn't exactly welcoming. My parents used it for storage mostly. Boxes, old furniture, and, oddly enough, some of our toys and games, things we used to play with all the time. But as much as my brother and I loved the idea of having a whole basement to play in, I always got this weird feeling whenever we were down there, like we weren't supposed to be. It didn't help that I'd sometimes hear strange noises from down there, like something shifting or scraping along the floor. I always told myself it was just the house settling or some junk shifting around. Nothing to worry about, right? Well, one day, something happened that I still can't explain, and it made me avoid that basement for the rest of my life. I was around 10 at the time, and my younger brother Daniel was about 8. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon, and we couldn't go outside, so naturally we decided to hang out in the basement and play with some of the old stuff down there. We had a bunch of things, an old foosball table, a carom board, even a video game console that barely worked. It wasn't fancy, but it kept us entertained. We were down there for a while, just messing around when I heard a soft thump behind me. At first, I thought it was just Daniel messing with me, so I turned around, ready to give him a playful shove, but he was across the room, looking just as confused as I felt. "What was that?" I asked. He shrugged. "I thought it was you." We both glanced around the room, and that's when we saw it, a small ball bouncing slowly across the floor. It wasn't moving fast, just kind of rolling and bouncing like someone had thrown it, but the weird thing was, neither of us had touched it. We both froze for a second, just staring at the ball as it came to a stop near the wall. Then, without a word, we both screamed and bolted for the stairs. I can't explain the kind of fear that gripped me in that moment. It wasn't like I thought we were in danger, exactly, but something about that ball moving on its own freaked me out in a way that I can't put into words. As we ran toward the basement door, something happened that made my blood turn cold. The door slammed shut right in front of us. We were just a few feet away when it happened. One second the door was open, and the next it was closed, with this loud, echoing bang that seemed to shake the whole basement. We stopped dead in our tracks, hearts pounding, not sure what to do. I reached out for the door handle, but no matter how hard I pulled, it wouldn't budge. It was like something was holding it closed from the other side. "Let us out!" I shouted, banging on the door as hard as I could. Daniel was crying by this point, tugging at my arm, begging me to get us out of there. But no matter how hard I tried, the door wouldn't move. I don't know how long we stood there, banging on the door and shouting, but eventually we heard our dad's voice from the other side. "Guys, are you okay in there?" "Dad, the door's stuck!" I yelled back, trying to keep my voice from shaking. I heard him jiggle the doorknob, and for a second I thought we were saved. But then he said something that made my stomach drop. "The door's not locked," he said, sounding confused. "It's open on my side." I didn't understand. If it was open on his side, why couldn't we get out? I pulled on the handle again, harder this time, but it still wouldn't move. "I'll try to push it open," my dad said. "You two step back." We did as he said, moving away from the door. I could hear him pushing against it from the other side, but it wasn't moving. After a few more tries, I heard him mutter something under his breath. He was starting to get frustrated, and honestly, so was I. Then, all of a sudden, the door flew open with a loud creak. My dad was standing there, looking confused and a little shaken. "What happened?" he asked, looking between us and the door. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "It just slammed shut." My dad didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked down at the door, then back at us. Finally, he sighed and said, "Come on, let's get out of here." We didn't need to be told twice. Daniel and I bolted up the stairs, not even bothering to look back. My dad followed us, and when we got to the top, he closed the basement door behind him, this time making sure it was securely latched. After that, we didn't talk about what had happened. My dad brushed it off, saying it was probably just a draft or something. But I knew better. There was no way a draft could have slammed that door shut and held it closed like that. Something had been down there with us, something I still don't understand to this day. We stopped playing in the basement after that. In fact, I don't think I went down there again until years later when we were cleaning out the house after my parents moved. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I still don't know what to make of it all. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe something really was down there that day. Either way, I don't think I'll ever set foot in a basement again. I've never been someone who loses things. You know how some people are constantly misplacing their keys or wallet, always in a rush to find them? That's not me. I'm the opposite. Everything has a place, and I'm pretty good about putting things back where they belong. That's why it was so strange when things started disappearing around my house. It started small. A set of keys here, a phone charger there, nothing too serious, just little things that I figured I'd misplaced in a moment of distraction. At the time, I was still living with my parents and younger siblings, so I just assumed one of them had borrowed my stuff and forgotten to return it. I'd always ask them, but they'd swear up and down that they hadn't touched anything. Of course, I didn't believe them. But then, after a while, it wasn't just little things. Food would go missing from the fridge. Not a lot, just enough to notice, like half a sandwich or a bottle of water. My siblings were always snacking, so again, I didn't think much of it. Then I moved out, got my own place, a small house in a quiet neighborhood. I thought that would be the end of it. I figured with no one else around, my stuff would stay put and I wouldn't have to deal with things vanishing anymore. But I was wrong. The disappearing items continued, even after I moved. At first, I laughed it off, thinking I was just stressed from the move or being careless in the new place. But it kept happening. My keys would vanish, only to reappear in a place I was sure I hadn't left them. Food would go missing from the kitchen. I'd find wrappers or empty containers that I didn't remember using. It was starting to get weird. And then there were the noises. At night, I'd hear soft thumps and creaks coming from the basement. It wasn't every night, but enough to make me notice. I figured it was just the house settling or the plumbing acting up. Old houses make noises, right? Still, it gave me a bad feeling. Every time I went down to check the basement, it was completely still. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After a few months of this, I started to get paranoid. I made a point to double-check where I put everything. I even started keeping a small notebook to track where I left my stuff, like my phone, wallet, and keys. But even then, things still went missing. One night after losing yet another set of keys, I heard the noises again, this time louder than usual. It wasn't just creaking or settling. It sounded like someone, moving around down there. A soft scraping sound, followed by what I could swear was a low thud like something being moved. I was done brushing it off. Grabbing a flashlight, I decided to go down to the basement and figure out what was going on once and for all. The basement in this house wasn't exactly creepy, but it had that cold, damp feeling that all basements seem to have. There wasn't much down there, just a washer and dryer, a few boxes, and some shelves with tools. Nothing unusual. I walked around, shining the flashlight into the corners, checking behind the shelves, but everything looked normal. No signs of anything, or anyone, out of place. But then, just as I was about to head back upstairs, I heard it again. That scraping noise, coming from behind the far wall. I froze, heart pounding. The noise was definitely coming from behind the wall. I slowly walked over, shining the flashlight across the surface. That's when I noticed something odd, a small crack in the corner, just where the wall met the floor. It was barely noticeable, but now that I was looking for it, I could see it. I crouched down, running my hand along the crack, and that's when I felt it, a slight draft. The air was cooler there, and I realized it wasn't just a crack. There was something behind that wall. My pulse quickened. What the hell was going on? I started pushing against the wall, running my fingers along the edges until I found a loose section of paneling. With a bit of force, I managed to pry it open, revealing a small, dark crawl space behind it. It was barely big enough to fit a person, but as I shined the flashlight inside, my stomach dropped. There, in the crawl space, was a pile of my things that had been missing for months. My keys, some clothes, food wrappers, even a couple of books. It was all there, shoved into this tiny space like someone had been hoarding it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the small, dirty mattress tucked in the back of the crawl space. It looked old, like it had been there for a while, and there were blankets and empty food containers scattered around it. Someone had been living down here, right under my nose the whole time. My head was spinning. I stumbled back, my mind racing. Whoever had been staying down there, they weren't there now. But how long had they been living in my basement? How had I not noticed? I grabbed my phone and called the police. They came out and checked the crawl space, but by the time they arrived, whoever had been living there was long gone. The police found more of my things stuffed into the crawl space, along with some cash that had gone missing from my wallet months ago. They told me I was lucky, that whoever it was had probably been using the crawl space to hide during the day and sneak around the house at night while I was asleep. I can't even describe how that made me feel. Knowing that someone had been in my home, watching me, stealing from me, it still gives me chills. I moved out of that house not long after. I couldn't stay there, not after what I found. I still don't know who it was or how they got in. The police never caught them. But sometimes, late at night, I think about the noises I heard and the things that went missing. And I wonder if they're still out there, hiding in someone else's basement, waiting for the right moment to slip inside. When my wife and I moved into our new house, it seemed perfect. A quiet neighborhood, plenty of space, and a big backyard for our future kids. We were excited to start this new chapter of our lives. But from the first night, there was something about the house that made me feel a little off. It was the basement. Now, I'm not one to get spooked easily, but there was just something about that place that unsettled me. Maybe it was how dark and cold it felt, even during the day. Maybe it was the way the steps creaked just a little too loudly when I walked down them. Or maybe it was the lights, the damn lights. You see, the basement lights would flicker, not constantly, but enough to notice. At first, I chalked it up to old wiring. The house was about 30 years old, so it made sense. My wife didn't think much of it either. "We'll call an electrician," she'd say every time I mentioned it. I'm sure it's nothing, but I wasn't so sure. There was something about the way those lights flickered, how they'd only go out for a second and then come back on, like someone was flipping the switch on and off just to mess with me. We had an electrician come out and check the wiring. He spent a couple of hours down there going through everything, but when he came back up, he said the wiring was fine. No issues. "Might just be an old bulb," he told me, shrugging like it was no big deal. He replaced the bulbs, and for a couple of days, everything seemed fine. But then the flickering started again. It wasn't every night. Sometimes it wouldn't happen for a week or two, but when it did, it always caught me off guard. I'd be sitting in the living room or lying in bed, and suddenly I'd notice it out of the corner of my eye, the basement light flickering on and off through the crack under the door. Every time it happened, I'd go down to check, but there was never anything there. Just the same old dusty boxes, shelves, and tools. It was frustrating, but I didn't know what else to do. My wife kept insisting it was nothing. "Probably just the wiring acting up again," she'd say. "We'll get someone to look at it." But deep down, I knew it wasn't the wiring. One night, I couldn't sleep. I was tossing and turning in bed, unable to shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. My wife was asleep next to me, breathing softly, but I was wide awake. And then, out of nowhere, I saw it again. The light under the basement door, flickering. This time, something in me snapped. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I got out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and headed for the basement. I didn't care what my wife said or what the electrician had told us. I was going to figure out what the hell was going on. I opened the basement door, and sure enough, the light was flickering. It was on for a few seconds, then off, then on again, like someone was playing with the switch. I gripped the flashlight tightly and started down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the bottom, I stood there for a moment, just watching the light flicker above me. Then, without warning, it stopped. The bulb stayed on, shining brightly as if nothing had happened. But that's when I noticed something else. The floor of the basement was covered in dust, thick, undisturbed dust that had probably been there for years. But in that dust, leading from the far corner of the room to the small window on the back wall, were footprints. They weren't mine, and they definitely weren't my wife's. The prints were larger than my own, like they belonged to someone with bigger feet. I froze, staring at them, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My mind raced. How could there be footprints down here? No one else had been in the basement, not since we'd moved in. And yet, there they were, clear as day, leading straight to the window. My stomach dropped. I followed the trail of prints, my flashlight trembling in my hand. As I got closer to the window, I could see that it had been tampered with. The latch was loose, and the edges of the frame were scratched, like someone had forced it open. Panic set in. Someone had been in my house. I rushed back upstairs, locking the basement door behind me. I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining what I'd found. They showed up about 20 minutes later and searched the entire house, top to bottom, including the basement. They confirmed what I already knew. Someone had been coming in through the basement window. The officer showed me the marks on the outside of the window where it had been pried open, probably with a crowbar. He told me it was likely someone had been using the basement as a way to enter and exit the house without being seen. They might have been coming in while we were at work, or even while we were sleeping. I felt sick to my stomach. The police couldn't tell me how long it had been going on or who had been doing it. They suggested installing a security system, which I did the very next day. But the thought that someone had been sneaking into my house, using the basement as their entrance, still haunts me. We've since moved out of that house, but I still think about the flickering lights and the footprints in the dust. I still wonder how long that person had been watching us, coming and going without us knowing. I'll never look at basements the same way again.